Today we will have we will begin with Elena Ojea, whose work on fisheries and climate adaptation reminds us that coastal communities are already living the future of climate change. Before Elena comes, I wanted to make sure that you all signed in. Have you all registered in that? In there at least once? At least once. Okay, that's important. And then we hopefully will have Joe. Is Joe online at the moment? Not yet. Joe will give us some perspectives from the Pacific. And then we'll look at other human dimensions, for instance, what it means to protect both the ocean and the right to stay in the face driven. After the break, I will let you know. So just stay with us, and let's welcome Elena for the first talk.
So you help me with that?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, good morning. Hope you're doing well after dinner. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to Marta and all the team. I'm enjoying very much these 3 days. Actually, it reminds me a lot how I started this research line in the University of Vigo with an ERC grant that allowed me to build up a small team of researchers like Marta, like this lab we're working with, and actually do this work. So I wanted to start showing who we are. Can you pass to the next one, please? So we are the Future Oceans Lab, a multidisciplinary group based in the University of Vigo in northwest Spain. So we are on the Atlantic side of Spain, just above Portugal. And we work on adaptation, basically in adaptation to climate change in marine social ecological systems. So this means fisheries, marine protected areas, coastal communities, and so on. Can you go next? And I'm going to start this talk with an introduction on climate change impacts on the oceans. So I really think this is a very strong figure from the IPCC Summary for Policymakers last report and the last cycle assessment. So this line shows the story of the climate change anomalies, globally speaking. So this is the temperature anomaly from pre-industrial era to for every year from the 1900s to just to almost today. So you see how it is not. So you can see how climate change has been increasing in the temperature anomaly until where we are now, around here, where we have more than 1 degree warm. The globe has warmed a little bit more than 1 degree on average. But what is striking from this is where we can see, depending on what we do now, and this is like the pathways we go through, emission scenarios, the emission efforts that we do, we can go either of these scenarios on the right, which can range from a very high temperature rise to lower temperature rise. Can you go back, please?
Sorry.
No worries. And what is and what the IPCC is showing in this figure is that this is just not numbers or bar figures. This is also lives of people and generations across the globe. And well, we see like generations like my parents, for example, for instance, which have started to live through warming these later years. My generation would be going through these scenarios in the future and already having a high temperature increase. But of course, people that are being born, like kids that have been born now, their lives will be very different depending on which way we go. So I think this really illustrates like the problem of climate change, even with like one variable, which is temperature anomaly, right? Can you go next? So how this translates to The oceans, of course, there's many impacts, as you may know, but some of the three most striking or more important ones that we're seeing, and this is maps for the last 100 years variation for the oceans. Of course, the oceans are warming too, or warming faster because they are absorbing heat from the atmosphere. So we're seeing, this would be mappings of what we observed, what happened so far, ocean warming, velocity of that warming. So this is warming, but this is how fast this is warming the oceans. You can see here tropical areas warming much more, faster, but also the Arctic, if you can see. And then there is these extreme events, which in relation to temperature is marine heat waves that are also happening. And this is a recent, it's not so far away that in time that they have, scientists have attributed marine heat waves to climate change, anthropogenic climate change too. So we are dealing with these changes in the oceans. Can you go next, please? And one of the impacts that we are studying and that we are seeing is how this temperature increase in the oceans, it's changing the distribution of marine life. And so what we're seeing is that these rising temperatures are making species move their niches because of thermal tolerance. So we're seeing range expansion, range contractions, and species moving away from warmer waters to colder waters. Please, next. And what we have observed, what scientists have observed is that on average, marine organisms have shifted almost 60 kilometers per decade on the last century on the ocean. And this change is on average, of course. So like sessile organisms cannot adapt because they don't have the ability to move as much. Other species can move. But on the kind of ecological impacts that we're seeing because of these range shifts can be around this circle from invasive species, new species interactions, range contractions, we're losing species in the colder, and of course habitation shifts. Next, please.
Yes.
So the question that we ask and the field where we work is on, okay, these changes are happening in the oceans, among others, due to climate change. So how are these changes affecting fishing communities across the globe? Next, please. And we are applying the social ecological systems framework, which is Ostrom's framework to understand the commons. And in this case, small-scale fisheries are a common example of a social ecological system, which it allows us to see fisheries as an interlinked system between, like all the levels from governance to collectives, individuals, and all the interactions they have, the formal, informal rules, and everything. Can you go next? And so when looking at the impacts, we can go from the ecological impacts that I just showed you in the previous figures to impacts on the fishery. So how, if you have species that are moving ranges, arriving to new places, leaving places that are warming fast. And of course, this is globally happening. I didn't say it, but these 60 kilometers per decade are shifting towards the poles because species are, in general, because the species are looking for colder waters. So what's happening is that the biodiversity of the tropics is expected to decrease more so. And so the fishery would have impacts because they would have new species interactions, changes in abundance. They would have to relocate effort, conflicts and so on. Economically, you could have like profit decreases, higher risks, changes in the markets, changes in trade, and so on. And impacts to society are related to migration, marginalization of vulnerable collectives, loss of social capital, and all the local knowledge and traditional knowledge linked to, for example, small-scale fisheries and fisheries facing poverty traps, for example. And very quickly, I wanted to show this just as an example of a paper that does a bioeconomic analysis to project the potential catch on EEZs in the future. So we're looking at a very far future to the year 2100. And these are the projections for two scenarios, a milder one and the higher emission scenario on the right. On the change in maximum sustainable yield, which is the potential maximum potential catch, and we're seeing what is important here is the inequalities, and it's those countries in the tropic areas, and it's those countries that have contributed less to climate change, bearing the higher impacts, and more so in the higher emission scenario. Next. So what? How can we face this? Of course, mitigation is the first. It has to be. We have to have stronger mitigation. But despite of the mitigation scenario, we have to work with adaptation already because we are facing these impacts of climate change already. So we are looking at small-scale fisheries because they represent globally 30% of global marine capture. They people and they supply chains. They pay over 500 million people, which is 10 times more than large-scale fisheries. So small-scale fisheries are very important in terms of people involved. And 40% globally of small-scale fishers are women. And of course, these are very vulnerable systems where, there's a very tight interaction between people and nature, their resources over time. There's, traditional ecological knowledge and culture that depends on these systems and nutrition as well. So we are trying to understand how our fishery communities responding, and what we do is relying on the literature on resilience, climate change resilience, and social ecological systems to understand what is the behavior of individual responses to climate change. Can we go forward once? One?
Was behind?
No, forward.
Okay.
Thanks. One more. Yeah. Just because it's easier. So we are what we know from the literature, but this hasn't been tested broadly, but what we saw in the literature is that fishers, not fishers, but the social fisheries, like the social ecological system, fishing communities, they can respond to impacts in an individual, collective, and governance level. And responses can go from, business as usual to incremental, systematic, or transformational change. And the way that translates into the system is, for example, at the individual level, you're facing impacts, you remain in your system, you continue doing the same. So you just stay with the same connection. Then another level of reaction would be, okay, I will adjust. So that this is like coping with climate change. So I will adjust, I will fish more or fish less. And then I will have more cooperation or things like that. When you talk about a systematic change, which could be it is adaptation, you are already diversifying your target species, you're diversifying gear, you're having more connections, you're collaborating, you're creating new networks or more collaborations. Also at the governance level, changing the institutional settings. And when you have a more transformational change in a small-scale fishery system, you would have completely diversified fisheries activity, you would have a new social capital would change. You would have like new or very restructured institutions. Next, please. And what we did was trying to populate this what we call adaptation pathway with the behavior that fishers are actually doing or telling us they would do. And so this would be examples. This is not exhaustive, but like the responses the fishers would tell you is like, no, if I'm facing these impacts, I would pray more, or I would stay doing the same. I would keep fishing. Those would be remaining strategies. Then you would have, I would change effort. I would ask for a loan, a credit. I will raise the prices of my fish. That would be coping strategies. Then if you're changing location because you have like shifting species or gear, you target new species that are coming, or you diversify income with other livelihoods at the same time, but without leaving fishing. That would be adapting. And then transforming would be changes like migration, changing the activity, looking for the market, for example, starting to export or others, and diversify livelihoods in a greater extent. And what we believe from the literature is that these responses should be happening across an increase in exposure or on climate change impacts. So, of course, if the impacts are low, you could like stay in this place. It could be safe. You could keep doing the same or adapting. But if you have very, very high changes, the fishers resilience would mean changing to a different system, right? So you would expect that these strategies happen across the exposure level, and this had been a theoretical expectation. So what we wanted to do is to test this in real settings. So next, please. So what we did in the lab over the last 8 years or so was look into detail on 3 case studies globally. And this was possible because of the ERC and a few busy physics. So we look at small-scale fisheries in 3 different settings. In Nayarit, in the Pacific coast of Mexico, in Galicia, where we are, which is one of the main small-scale fisheries regions in Europe, and in Shikoku, Japan, which is an island where biologists have seen a shift in habitats. So like coral reefs are substituting forest across the coastline of that island. So we had a very good natural experiment to see how fishers along that gradient were shifting. And we used the adaptive capacity framework from Sinner and Barnes, which tell us the fishers have. But we also asked fishers how they would respond to scenarios, and also asked how they responded to the last changes. In total, we had a lot of questionnaires, 1,000 from all together. We put all the database together to analyze it with this question. And of course, there's a high diversity with more than 100 species, many different management systems. And then we went back to the communities for showing them what we did with 10 total results workshops. Okay, and the interesting thing is that these communities have seen a different degree of changes. When we did the survey in Galicia, this was 2018, people weren't really aware of climate change impacts. This has changed now a lot. So people are now very worried, and we have seen the changes, but not when we did the survey. Chicago is looking at, is having this range shift. And then Nayarit, fishers were saying that they have seen a 50% decrease in catches for the last 10 years. So that was where they're more exposed to climate change. And I think I have the results already. Oh no, yeah, this is so we basically proposed 3 catch decrease and income decreases scenarios in the community, in the different places, and asked them how would they respond. And then we classify those responses to do what I'm going to show you next. And basically what we see, so this would be Galicia, Nayarit, and Shikoku. And this would be the three scenarios. But for Nayarit and Shikoku, we just have two for different reasons that we can talk later. But what we see is that actually we see that features follow the continuum, right? So when you have lower scenarios, you have mainly remain and coping responses, not as much in Nayarit because they're already facing huge impacts, but also in Japan. Then when you move to higher impacts, you're having more adaptation here, and then you would have more transformative responses when you have the greater impact. So somehow this would make sense to what we thought theoretically. But what is interesting here is to understand, okay, those that are not following this continuum, like we have extreme scenarios of cash decrease and income decrease, and we still have people not able to adapt. And this can be to a lot of people, right? So next one, please. This would be the same figure, but just in a different format. So we would have the scenarios and the range of people responding on each way. So we see here that, you know, like the greater the impact, the less people remaining, the less people coping. There's like an adaptation window on the middle scenarios, and then you would have the high transformation at the end. So it makes sense, but still, sorry. But still, we still have to think that even if remain strategies are going down, we still see that 50% on average across the places. 50% of people are still remaining in the system when you have very, very high impacts that over 75% decrease. And this would mean that there's potential to a poverty trap there, that people really are not able to leave the fishery even though it's unsustainable economically for them. So this is the main result, and what we're doing now is trying to understand, okay, who is not able to follow the continuum? Who are the features that even though you have very high scenarios of change, they will still remain, and we're trying to understand that in our work, which I don't have the results yet, but is the main question that we get from these results, and you can go next. So basically, to wrap up very quickly, what we are seeing is that globally and locally for small-scale fisheries, climate change is again exacerbating inequality. And we see like very clear climate injustices if we already, but also these would increase if we don't act. And we see that there's a high risk of communities facing poverty traps. And we haven't discussed this, but among these resilience strategies, there's a lot of maladaptation happening. And maladaptation would be the responses that that have negative feedbacks over the social ecological system. So, for example, when you have fishers fishing more, that would be a negative effect on the stocks, on the fishery research system. Or you have some strategies that are diversifying with illegal activities as well. So we are also looking at that as to see, okay, you are increasing your resilience, but what is the maladaptation that is happening there and why? So that would come next, I guess. So just to finalize, if you're interested, you can check our web. We have 2 videos of Galicia and Nayarit on how fishers feel about climate change impacts and adaptation. And then one of, she's a postdoc, Xochitl, but she did contemporary dance of her PhD fieldwork in Mexico. So on how fishers are affected by climate change and responding to climate change in Mexico, if you're interested. And next. And then we're also collaborating. So I just put it because I want to say that the way you communicate these things to communities is very difficult because you're telling a very sad story and you don't have the answers. So we try to engage the fishing communities with arts-based methods lately, and it's working well because you get people being able to talk about their emotions as well, not just showing data and discussing data. And this is, for example, a sculpture that our team with the shellfishers in Galicia did for a recent exhibition using litter from the beaches. And that's all. Thank you.
We can have questions now.
Elena, very nice talk and an amazing amount of work, not to do 1,000 interviews. Amazing. So I was wondering these strategies through the how the governance system can influence, if you have seen differences between your three study areas related not only to the individual responses but to the all of these other systems. And yeah, if you could extend a little bit more.
Thank you. It's a great question. It's very, I think it's one of the hardest things to do in this, moving from the individual level to the governance level and see what are the, the relationships and how transformation individually grows to the system transformation. That's like a very hard question to answer. But so far we haven't looked at that very much, but a little bit we did because, yeah, so for example, in Nayarit, there's well, I don't know where to start. In Nayarit, 60% of the small-scale fishers don't have a formal permit to fish. So that means a lot of things. That means that they have to work most of them have to work in a patron-client relationship. So they fully depend on what we call patrons to, for loans, for selling, for boats, for everything. And we actually have seen that is related to lower resilience and lower capacity to adapt. For sure, so we have seen that, and we have a paper on that. But we haven't compared yet across case studies. It's a little bit difficult. We were interested in Japan and Galicia because they have territorial use rights for fisheries. So, fishers, some of the fishers have exclusive access over the resources. And we think that has helped them respond. But in some ways, for example, they are able to organize themselves better. They're able to participate more, get more training. But on the other side, they are not able to, they cannot move, they cannot change gear. They cannot change locations. They cannot transform as much. So, for example, we are seeing that many people in the poverty traps are within those systems. But we haven't, there's a lot of questions there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for a really interesting presentation. About 5 slides ago, you had these a graph showing the movement of people into more adaptation as things got more extreme. But there was also some movement the other way of people who had been adapting and transforming, who then went down to coping and remaining. And I wonder what drove that. Is that effect of age? Have you become less able to transform? Is it people falling into some form of poverty, asset poverty, perhaps? What was going on there?
Thanks. That's a great question to beginning to look at it. So we are now looking at people, like we're now grouping people depending on the behavior they have over the adaptation pathway. And that group, the ones that we call them backward jumpers, um, we see that they're older, but we are still trying to understand who these people are. I don't have an answer yet. I think it's people that are not, they're retiring soon. They're not able to, some of them, most of them, they're not able to, they don't want to exit or are not able to exit the fishery. So, but the impacts are so high that they have to, they already transformed, they have to keep doing the same. They're not able to respond in that way more. Actually, we have that happening in Japan. In the case study in Japan, we are seeing one of our hypotheses is that there has happened already a transformation in the system because of this coral reef, kelp to coral reef shift. Some fishers have transformed, doing more aquaculture, doing even tourism or extracting corals for tourism. So yeah, I think it has to do with age and with where the case study is in terms of the impacts they're varying and transforming, but it's a complex question to answer. I don't have the full answer yet.
I was wondering, in relation to the question on the governance, whether if it makes a difference whether the fishers are organized or not for the adaptation, instead of more an individual answer, instead of a collective one. I don't know if you have studied this.
Yeah, we're seeing that, but we're seeing that, yes. So we are measuring, for example, the organization also informally in terms of the bonding links within a sector. So we have, we see the fisheries, and then we see, okay, shell fishers, which are mostly women, on board fishers, blah, blah, blah. So we're looking at both the interactions between groups and the interactions within the group, which is not exactly the governance, but is an informal reflection of how they're organized. And we're seeing that bonding, which means within group, is helping adaptation. But we see that bridging, which would be in between groups, helps transformation. So yes, I think it's hard to give a broad answer, but we are seeing that, for example, the example I was talking about, the people that are organizing territorial use rights fishers, they are very well organized, so they are able to cope because they have almost a co-management system or a close to co-management, so they can, easily change the quotas, decide which days they go fishing. They can cope very well. They can adapt somehow because they organize themselves, or diversifying with tourism a little bit, or selling elsewhere. But they are not able to transform. So it's a double edge.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. A very interesting presentation. I'd just like to go back a little bit on the interaction factors across the movement of fish. I think you said that there's been this shift, I think over 16 kilometers. Yeah. Is it that just inland, like looking for colder waters, right? But in climate change interacts with many other factors. Yeah. I just wonder whether you had to look at the extent to which there is this interaction, because I looked at the figure that you put there on the impacts, right? Mostly tropical countries will have less fish in the future, right? And when we look at the cause of climate change, we know that there's very little responsibility. And in other presentation that we had earlier, we saw that some countries are shifting maybe their bad fishing practices to these tropical areas. That help to further exacerbate the loss of fish. I think my question as well relate to what you're trying to say by pushing adaptation to the victims and not to those who are responsible for exacerbating the problem in the first place. So I don't know whether in terms of maybe trying to maybe quantify the cost level, right? So that from there we can be able to maybe target adaptation responses to those mostly responsible for promoting or exacerbating the problem. I don't know whether I'll put that clearly, but you understand what I'm saying to come from. Like, should we measure the cost more and then put the response to those who are more responsible in causing the problem? Whether maybe your research can help identify that and maybe look for responses in that way.
Thank you. Yeah, so if I understood, you're suggesting that a way forward would be understanding the costs of climate change to the countries bearing the higher impacts and trying to direct adaptation.
Then, and not to the victims, because I think if they adapt their own practices, those who are bearing the brunt, I think, will have fish in their waters. They will not have issues, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't, so when the study that I show looking at the maximum catch potential includes everything. So it's not just small scale fisheries, it's large scale fisheries as well. So it's like based on all the resources that are fish nowadays. Versus this work with fishers is just very, it's a small scale fishery, so it's like coastal fisheries. But we are seeing that the reason why we see in Nayarit in Mexico that fishers are not able to transform is just because, yeah, the impacts are already being very, very strong. And the way even though we see adaptation there, mostly it's maladaptation, right? They're migrating to the US, they're engaging in illegal fishing, they're engaging even in drug dealing. So we are not experts on that on that part. I think many in the room would be. So if you're interested, we could talk about it. But yeah, I don't know how to. I think maybe showing, as you say, I mean, it's just I think it's a great suggestion. I think we have to highlight more what are these costs and who's benefiting and not, because there's a clear climate injustice,
Great. Thank you very much, Elena.